January 10th, 1945. -10 degrees Celsius. A man crouched behind a Browning M1919 machine gun strapped to a wooden table inside a crumbling French bakery. The barrel glowed red from 48 hours of continuous fire. Around his boots lay thousands of spent brass casings forming golden piles that reached his ankles. His glasses were held together with field wire. The lenses were cracked in 7 places. Outside, 2 German battalions from the elite 21st Panzer Division kept advancing, and they kept dying. 42 confirmed kills in 48 hours. 1 man against hundreds. His name was Vito Bertoldo, a coal miner from Decatur, Illinois. The United States Army had rejected him twice. Poor eyesight, they said. Too weak to fight, they said. They made him a cook. His commanders called him a discipline problem. Now he was about to save 517 American soldiers using skills he learned 600 feet underground in the darkness of an Illinois coal mine. If you want to understand how a nearly blind cook held off the German army alone for 2 days, you need to understand what happens when a man who spent 9 years working in absolute darkness finally sees daylight through the reticle of a machine gun. December 1916. Decatur, Illinois. Central Illinois coal country. This was Vito Bertoldo's world. Not the green fields above ground, not the factories or the farms. His world existed 600 feet below the surface where sunlight never reached and silence meant death. By the time Vito turned 17, he was already working the Springfield coal seam for the Decatur Coal Company. Over 600 men worked those mines. 12-hour shifts. The seam was only 4 feet high. Men worked crouched or crawling on their hands and knees. The tools were simple: an 8-pound pickaxe, a shovel, a carbide lamp mounted on a cloth cap. That lamp was everything. Without it, the darkness was absolute. You could hold your hand 1 inch from your face and see nothing. Not the wall, not the ceiling, not the rats that scurried past your boots. The air was thin and filled with coal dust that coated your lungs with every breath. Cave-ins killed men in seconds. No warning, no mercy. Just tons of rock crushing everything beneath. You learned to listen, or you died. A creak in the timber support beams meant the ceiling was shifting. A sound like wind where there should be no wind meant gas buildup. Methane. Odorless. Invisible. A single spark, and the entire tunnel became a crematorium. Men burned alive before they could scream. Vito worked 9 years in those tunnels. 9 years of darkness. 9 years of listening for sounds that meant survival or death. His eyes adapted to almost zero light. He could detect movement in near darkness that other men would completely miss. Underground, you learned that movement was sound before it was image. You heard the rat before you saw it. You heard the rock shifting before the collapse came. His hands became calloused from years of gripping the pickaxe handle and carrying 50-pound bags of coal for hours without rest. His body learned to function in confined spaces where panic meant death. The geometry of tunnels became instinctive. He could navigate by feel and memory alone. He knew which shaft connected to which seam without thinking. Vito never considered these skills valuable. They were simply what you did to survive another shift, another day, another year in the darkness. Then December 7th, 1941 happened, and everything changed. Pearl Harbor, the draft. America was at war. Vito Bertoldo went to enlist voluntarily. He wanted to fight. He wanted to do his part like every other young man in Decatur. The medical examiner tested his vision. Severe myopia, thick glasses that made his eyes look twice their normal size. The recruiting officer barely looked at him. Go home. You cannot see well enough to shoot Germans. Vito was humiliated. His friends from the mine were accepted. They marched off to training camps with pride in their eyes. Vito was sent home like a child rejected from a schoolyard game. But the recruiting officer did not understand something about coal miners. When you work 600 feet underground, you develop a particular kind of stubbornness. The kind that keeps a man swinging a pickaxe for 12 hours when his muscles are screaming and the air is so thin he can barely breathe. The kind that keeps a man going back into the darkness day after day, even after watching his friends die in cave-ins. Vito enlisted again in 1942. Different recruiting office, different examiner. He passed. But the Army still did not trust his eyes. They made him a cook, military police cook. He did not come to cook. He came to fight. For 2 years he argued. He petitioned. He requested transfer after transfer. His mess sergeant grew to hate him. Vito was not a quiet complainant. He was loud, persistent, annoying. A discipline problem, they called him. The kind of soldier who questioned orders and demanded better assignments. Most men would have given up. Most men would have accepted their fate and spent the war making breakfast for officers who would never see combat. Vito was not most men. Finally, in December 1944, his transfer came through. 42nd Infantry Division. The Rainbow Division. Company A, 242nd Infantry Regiment. Destination, Alsace, France. By then, Vito had made himself so unpopular with his mess sergeant that when the battalion command requested 3 soldiers per company for command post security, his company commander, Captain William Corson, saw an opportunity. Send Bertoldo. Get him out of the company. It was a punishment disguised as duty. A way to get rid of a troublemaker. They had no idea they were sending a coal miner with 9 years of survival training into the most desperate battle of his life. January 8, 1945. Evening. Hatton, Alsace. A typical Alsatian village near the German border. Stone and brick buildings 3 to 4 stories tall. Small windows designed to keep out the brutal winter cold. Narrow streets only 4 to 6 meters wide between structures. The command post was an old French bakery at the northern entrance of the village. Vito Bertoldo arrived carrying a Browning M1919 A4 machine gun. The weapon weighed 14 kilograms, 31 pounds of steel and death. The barrel was 609 millimeters long. Rate of fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Effective range 1400 meters under ideal conditions. Belt fed with 250 round cloth belts. There was one problem. Vito had never received formal training on this weapon, not a single hour of instruction. He learned by watching other soldiers, by doing. By figuring it out himself the same way he figured out how to survive in the mines. You watch, you learn, you adapt. The M1919A4 was normally tripod-mounted and required a 2-man crew, a gunner and an assistant gunner to help reload and clear jams. Vito would be alone. He set up the weapon in the street facing north. The primary approach into Hatton. The temperature was -10 degrees Celsius. Water froze in canteens within minutes. The ground was frozen solid as concrete. Intelligence reports were not encouraging. Germans were concentrating forces north of Hatton for Operation Nordwind, Hitler's desperate attempt to recapture Alsace and Strasbourg. The 21st Panzer Division was identified in the sector. Hundreds of veteran soldiers with armor support. Tanks. Half-tracks. Artillery. Against them stood Vito Bertoldo with his cracked glasses and a machine gun he barely knew how to operate. January 9, 1945. 3:47 in the morning. Battalion staff woke Vito with urgent news. Evacuation of the command post might be necessary within hours. German forces were massing for attack. Hold as long as possible, they said. Vito positioned himself behind the M1919 in the street. The darkness was total. Dawn would not arrive until 800 hours. New moon. Zero natural illumination. Most soldiers would have been blind. Most soldiers would have stared into the darkness and seen nothing but fear. But Vito's eyes had spent 9 years adapting to the absolute darkness of the coal mines. Darkness was his natural environment. He waited. At 500 hours, he heard it. The sound came before the visual, just like in the mines. Tank treads on frozen ground. Metallic clanking. Rhythmic. Growing louder. Then the shape emerged from the darkness 60 meters away. A German heavy tank. likely a Tiger. 57 tons of armor. 88mm main gun that could destroy anything in its path. The silhouette was massive against the gray pre-dawn sky. Vito's finger rested on the trigger. He calculated. 30 caliber rounds would not penetrate tank armor. If he fired, the tank would identify his position and kill him instantly. He did not fire. The tank passed within 30 meters. Treads grinding. Exhaust fumes visible in the frozen air. Then it was gone. Vito waited. 10 minutes later came a different sound. Diesel engines, lighter than tanks. 2 German half-tracks descended the street. SDKFZ 251 armored personnel carriers. Approximately 20 Panzer Grenadiers in each vehicle. 40 elite German soldiers total. The half-tracks stopped 30 meters from Vito's position. Rear doors opened. Infantry dismounted. MP-40 submachine guns. K98K rifles. MG-42 portable machine guns. The soldiers formed a tactical line and began advancing up the street toward the command post. 25 meters, 20 meters, 15 meters. Underground, you do not strike the coal seam too early. You wait for the correct moment. You let the target come to you. You conserve your energy and your fuel. You strike at the perfect distance for maximum effect. 15 meters, close enough to see their faces in the darkness. Vito squeezed the trigger. The M1919 roared to life. The sound was not the sharp crack of a rifle. It was deeper, rhythmic, thunderous. 400 rounds per minute, tearing through the frozen air. Vito held the trigger for 6 seconds, approximately 50 rounds. The first row of Panzer Grenadiers collapsed instantly. 8 to 10 men dead within 6 seconds. Bodies crumpled to the frozen ground before they could react. The remaining Germans dove for cover behind walls and debris. But Vito could not celebrate. The belt was empty. 250 rounds expended. He needed to reload. This operation normally required 2 men. Vito was alone. He released the feed tray with practiced movements, pulled a fresh belt from the ammunition box, threaded it into the mechanism, closed the tray. 12 seconds. During those 12 seconds, the Germans returned fire. MP-40s and K98Ks, spitting bullets that snapped past his head with supersonic cracks. The sound of rounds passing within inches of your skull. Vito ignored them. He chambered a round, resumed firing. 8-second burst. 60 to 70 rounds. The remaining infantry fell or retreated behind the half-tracks. But this was only the beginning. The Germans would regroup. They would bring tanks, artillery, more infantry. Hundreds of soldiers against one nearly blind coal miner with cracked glasses and a machine gun. The battle for Hatton had just begun. Over the next 2 hours, Vito killed an estimated 15 more Germans. Bodies began piling in the street, creating obstacles for the advancing troops. He adjusted his angle of fire to shoot over the corpses. His ammunition supply dwindled with every burst. His training as a miner informed his discipline. Underground, you conserve your carbide lamp fuel. Above ground, you conserve ammunition. Short controlled bursts, 4 to 6 seconds maximum. Never waste a round. The Germans adapted. They sent groups of 10 to 15 men advancing in tactical rushes. Cover to cover. Fire and maneuver. Textbook infantry tactics. But Vito had learned something in the mines that no textbook could teach. Patience. Timing. The ability to wait in darkness until the perfect moment to strike. At 800 hours, dawn finally arrived. Gray winter light revealed the full horror of what Vito faced. Hundreds of German soldiers concentrated north of his position. Tanks, half-tracks, infantry formations stretching back into the morning mist. A German Panzer IV advanced to within 75 yards. The turret rotated with mechanical precision. The 75mm main gun aimed directly at Vito's position. He had 3 seconds to decide: stay and die, or move and fight. Vito grabbed the M1919, 31 pounds of weapon plus tripod. He dragged it into the bakery just as the Panzer fired. The high-explosive round detonated exactly where he had been 5 seconds earlier. A 2-meter crater appeared in the street where Vito had been sitting. But Vito was already repositioning inside the building, strapping the machine gun to a heavy wooden table, angling it toward a window facing the main street. Better cover, better concealment. He resumed firing. Another wave of German infantry fell. The coal miner was just getting started. But here is what Vito did not know. The Germans had identified his position. They were bringing heavier weapons, self-propelled artillery, 88mm guns that could turn the bakery into rubble. And Vito was running low on ammunition. What happened next would push him to the absolute limits of human endurance. 40 more hours of continuous combat, 3 direct hits from tank shells, a building collapsing around him, and a desperate sprint through enemy fire that would determine whether 517 American soldiers lived or died. In Part 2, we will see how Vito Bertoldo used every skill he learned in 9 years underground to survive the most brutal 48 hours of the entire Alsace campaign. The Germans thought they were fighting a simple American soldier. They had no idea they were fighting a man who had already survived 1,000 near deaths in the darkness beneath Illinois. In Part 1, we witnessed how Vito Bertoldo, a nearly blind coal miner rejected twice by the United States Army, found himself alone behind a machine gun facing 2 German battalions. In just 3 hours, he had already killed over 20 enemy soldiers. He had dodged a tank shell by 3 seconds. He had repositioned inside a French bakery and turned it into a fortress. But the Germans were not retreating. They were regrouping. They were bringing heavier weapons, 88mm self-propelled guns that could level buildings, and Vito was running low on ammunition. 4 belts remaining. 1,000 rounds against hundreds of soldiers. The math did not work, but mathematics had never stopped a coal miner before. And this is where everything became worse. Inside the bakery, Vito established his new fighting position. The M1919 was strapped to a heavy wooden table with rope from his pack. The table sat against a stone wall, providing better protection than the open street. He angled the weapon toward a window facing the main approach. Outside, the Germans reorganized their assault. They had learned that frontal charges meant death. They adapted. They stopped advancing in large groups during daylight. Instead, they began probing attacks. Small teams of 5 to 8 men moving between buildings, testing Vito's field of fire, looking for blind spots. The temperature remained at -10°C. Vito's fingers were numb despite his gloves. The metal of the machine gun burned cold against his skin. His canteen had frozen solid within the first 6 hours. No water, no food, no relief. Just the weight of the weapon and the endless sound of German boots on frozen ground. But Vito had survived worse. 9 years underground taught him that discomfort was not death. You could be cold and still fight. You could be hungry and still work. You could be exhausted beyond measure and still swing a pickaxe. The body complains. The mind decides. And Vito's mind had decided that he was not dying in this bakery. The Germans brought mortars. The first rounds landed 40 yards short of the bakery. Explosions sent frozen dirt and debris into the air. Vito recognized the pattern immediately. Underground, when a shaft begins to collapse, the sequence is predictable. First, the small rocks fall from the ceiling. Then, larger rocks. Then, the entire structure comes down. Mortar teams work the same way. They bracket their target. First shot short, second shot closer, third shot on target. Vito counted the seconds between impacts. 12 seconds. The mortar crew was experienced, fast reloading. The second salvo landed 20 yards short, closer. Shrapnel pinged against the bakery's stone walls. Vito grabbed the M1919 and moved to a different window on the opposite side of the room. He had 8 seconds before the third salvo arrived. He made it in 6. The third salvo struck exactly where he had been positioned. The window exploded inward. Glass and stone fragments filled the air. The wooden table where the machine gun had been mounted was reduced to splinters. If Vito had hesitated for even 2 seconds, he would have been dead. But coal miners do not hesitate when ceilings collapse. They move or they die. Same principle above ground. Move or die. Vito resumed firing from his new position. A group of German infantry had used the mortar barrage as cover to advance. They were now 30 meters from the bakery, moving along the eastern wall. Vito adjusted his angle and fired a 4-second burst. 30 rounds. 5 Germans collapsed. The rest scattered back into cover. The mortar team adjusted their aim toward his new position. Vito recognized the sound of the tubes firing. He moved again before the rounds landed. This became his pattern for the next 3 hours. Fire 4 to 6 seconds. Move to a new window before the Germans could adjust. The M1919 weighed 31 pounds. Each movement required lifting the weapon, carrying it across the room, and repositioning it on a new surface. 12 seconds per move. The German mortar crew required 15 to 20 seconds to identify his new position, adjust their aim, and fire. Vito had a 3 to 8 second margin. Not much, but enough. He moved 11 times in 3 hours. Each time the Germans fired at the position he had just left. Explosions tore through the building. Walls crumbled. Ceiling beams cracked. The bakery was being systematically destroyed around him. But Vito kept moving. Keep moving or die. The same lesson he learned 600 feet underground. At midnight between January 9th and 10th, an officer approached Vito. The man's face was pale, his voice urgent. "We are evacuating this command post. New location 400 yards to the rear. More substantial structure with stone construction and better defensive position." Vito looked at the officer. His glasses were cracked in 7 places, now held together with wire. His uniform was soaked with frozen sweat and gunpowder residue. "How many people need to evacuate?" The officer counted. 10 to 12 staff, including battalion intelligence officers with classified documents. Vito calculated. 400 yards of exposed terrain. Narrow streets. Germans had line of sight from multiple positions. The staff would be sitting ducks. Someone needs to cover the withdrawal. The officer stared at him. "You cannot hold them alone." Vito did not argue. He simply asked one question. "How long do you need?" The officer thought. 20 to 30 minutes for safe withdrawal. Vito checked his ammunition. Approximately 1,000 rounds remaining. 4 belts, against hundreds of Germans with tank support and artillery. The mathematics still did not work. Vito nodded. "Go. I will hold them." The officer hesitated. "This is not an order, Sergeant. You can evacuate with us." Vito turned back to his weapon. "With respect, sir, someone has to cover the retreat. And I did not come to France to cook breakfast." The officer said nothing more. He understood. Some men are built differently. Some men have spent so many years facing death underground that death above ground seems almost familiar. The staff began evacuating. Boots running down corridors. The rear door opening and closing. Then silence inside the building. Outside, tank engines rumbled. German voices called out commands. Vito adjusted his grip on the M1919 and waited. The next 6 hours were the longest of Vito Bertoldo's life. Without the battalion staff, he was completely alone. No one to bring ammunition. No one to help clear jams. No one to share the burden of constant vigilance. The Germans intensified their assault. They knew the Americans were evacuating. They wanted to capture the command post before the staff escaped with their documents. Wave after wave of infantry advanced through the streets. Vito fired in controlled bursts. 4 seconds. Move. 4 seconds. Move. His ammunition dropped from 1,000 rounds to 800, then 600, then 400. Each belt that ran empty brought him closer to the end. At 0600 hours on January 10th, dawn began breaking over Hatton. Gray winter light filtered through the smoke and dust. Visibility improved. Vito could finally see the full scope of what he faced, and it was terrifying. A German Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun had positioned itself 75 yards from the bakery. The 75mm main gun was aimed directly at his window. Behind the assault gun stood dozens of infantry waiting for the building to be destroyed so they could advance. Vito recognized the danger immediately. The Sturmgeschütz was not like the tanks he had dodged before. It was a dedicated assault weapon designed specifically to destroy fortified positions. One direct hit, and the bakery would become his tomb. The Sturmgeschütz fired. Vito threw himself sideways as the 75mm round punched through the wall and detonated inside the room. The explosion was catastrophic. The concussion wave launched him 4 meters across the room. His back slammed into the opposite wall with enough force to crack plaster. His glasses flew off his face. His ears rang with a high-pitched tone that blocked all other sound. Debris rained down from the ceiling. Dust filled his lungs. For 5 seconds, Vito could not move. For 5 seconds, he lay on the floor wondering if his spine was broken. Then training took over. 9 years underground had taught him that the moments after an explosion were the most dangerous. If the ceiling was going to collapse, it would collapse now. He needed to move. Vito crawled across the debris-covered floor searching for his glasses. His vision without them was a blur of shapes and shadows. He found them near the far wall, cracked worse than before. The wire holding them together was bent. He straightened the wire with numb fingers and put them back on. The world came back into focus. The room was destroyed. The wall where he had been positioned had a hole 2 meters wide. Sunlight streamed through dust particles. The ceiling beams were cracking. The same sound he had heard 100 times underground. The building was about to collapse. Vito grabbed the M1919 and ran. He left the remaining ammunition behind. No time. He sprinted out the back door into the streets of Hatton. A German MG-42 opened fire from somewhere to his left. 1,200 rounds per minute. The fastest firing machine gun in the world. Bullets struck the walls around him, sending stone fragments into the air. Vito ran with 31 pounds of weapon on his shoulder. The ground was ice. His boot slipped. He fell. His knee struck frozen ground with agonizing force. He stood and kept running. 400 yards to the alternate command post. 366 meters of frozen streets with German bullets snapping past his head. Supersonic cracks filled the air. Ricochets whined off walls. Vito's lungs burned. His legs burned. His knees screamed with every step, but he kept running. 90 seconds of pure survival. He burst through the entrance of the alternate command post, a 3-story stone building with small windows. Battalion staff from a different unit stared at him. A wild-eyed man, covered in dust and debris, carrying a machine gun. "Who are you?" Vito did not answer. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, found a window facing east, positioned the M1919 on the stone windowsill, and resumed firing. The alternate command post became Vito's second fortress. But the Germans had followed him. Within minutes, they concentrated their forces on this new building. Panzer IVs, Sturmgeschütz assault guns. The 88mm self-propelled gun that had been targeting the bakery repositioned to engage the new target. Vito was down to his last ammunition belt. 250 rounds. At his rate of fire, that meant approximately 5 minutes of combat. 5 minutes, and then nothing. He calculated his options. 50 rounds per burst equals 5 bursts. Approximately 30 seconds of active fire time. After that, he would have a rifle. After the rifle ran out of ammunition, he would have grenades. After the grenades, he would have his hands. The Germans were not going to take this command post. Vito had decided. The 88mm gun advanced down the street. It stopped 3 to 5 meters from the building. Point-blank range. The crew positioned the weapon with its muzzle nearly inside the building. They were going to fire directly into the room. There would be no dodging this shot, no moving to another window. This was the end. The 88 fired. The high-explosive shell detonated inside the room where Vito was positioned. The world became fire and noise and pain. Vito was thrown against the wall for the third time in 8 hours. His eardrums ruptured. Blood poured from his nose and ears. His ribs cracked from the concussion. Other soldiers in the command post were killed or seriously wounded. Vito lay on the floor, unable to hear anything except a high-pitched ringing that seemed to come from inside his skull. His glasses had fallen off again. He crawled through debris and bodies searching for them, found them, put them on. They were held together by wire and luck and nothing else. But they worked. An American bazooka team on the lower floor fired an M9A1 rocket at the 88mm gun. The rocket struck the vehicle in the side where the armor was weakest. The gun ignited. Black smoke and flames erupted from the engine compartment. The German crew abandoned the burning vehicle, 4 to 5 men jumping out and running for cover. Vito watched them through his cracked lenses. He was dazed, bleeding, barely conscious, but he was not dead. And as long as he was not dead, he was fighting. Vito crawled back to the M1919. His last belt was still loaded. He aimed at the fleeing German crew and fired. 4-second burst. 3 of the crew members fell. The rest scattered. But a German Panzer IV had seen the muzzle flash. The tank rotated its turret and fired. The 75mm round struck the room directly. The M1919 was destroyed. The mechanism shattered into pieces, completely inoperable. Vito was thrown across the room a 4th time. He lay in the debris for 5 seconds, then 10 seconds. Outside German infantry saw that the machine gun fire had stopped. They began their final assault, advancing from 30 meters, 20 meters, 15 meters. Vito stood. He had no machine gun, but he found 3 white phosphorus grenades in his equipment. He pulled the pins and threw them through the shattered window. The grenades detonated among the advancing Germans. White phosphorus burns at 1500 degrees Celsius. It cannot be extinguished with water. It burns through clothing and skin and muscle. The Germans broke and retreated, screaming, burning. But Vito knew they would return. They always returned. The final German assault came minutes later, heavier than before. More tanks, more artillery, more infantry. An officer grabbed Vito's shoulder. "Sergeant, we are evacuating. Everyone out now." Vito picked up an M1 Garand rifle from a wounded soldier. "You go. I cover." The officer started to argue. Vito cut him off. "I did not survive 48 hours to die running." "Go." The officer went. Vito positioned at a window. 8 rounds in the Garand. He fired. The distinctive ping of the empty clip echoed through the room. He reloaded. 8 more rounds. Fired. Reloaded. The Germans stopped advancing. They could not understand how this position was still fighting. They had hit it with tank shells, with artillery, with hundreds of soldiers, and still someone was shooting back. Vito held the window until the last officer escaped. Then he prepared to run again. But this time he heard something different. American voices, American engines, reinforcements from the 79th Infantry Division and elements of his own 42nd Division breaking through German lines. Soldiers poured into the alternate command post. They found Vito barely conscious, still gripping a rifle. Around him lay thousands of spent brass casings forming golden piles that reached his ankles. His glasses were held together with wire. His uniform was soaked with blood and sweat and dust. 48 hours. 42 confirmed German kills. 517 American soldiers successfully evacuated because one coal miner refused to stop fighting. But here is what the official reports do not tell you. The Germans who survived Hatton talked about the machine gunner who would not die. They told stories of a single American who seemed to be everywhere at once, shooting from windows that should have been destroyed, surviving explosions that killed everyone else. The legend spread through German units in Alsace. And legends are dangerous things in war. Because when soldiers begin to fear one man, they begin to question everything. In Part 3, we will see what happened when Vito Bertoldo woke up in a field hospital. When the army realized what he had actually accomplished, And when the question arose of whether one coal miner from Illinois deserved the highest honor his nation could give, the Medal of Honor selection process would prove almost as brutal as the battle itself, and the enemies Vito faced in Washington would be far more dangerous than any German soldier. In Part 1, a nearly blind coal miner named Vito Bertoldo was sent to guard a command post as punishment for being a discipline problem. In Part 2, he held that command post alone for 48 hours against 2 German battalions, killing 42 enemy soldiers and saving 517 American lives. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found him barely conscious, surrounded by thousands of spent brass casings still gripping a destroyed machine gun. His glasses were held together with wire. His eardrums were ruptured. His ribs were cracked. Blood covered his face, but he was alive. And now the question became, what do you do with a man who accomplished the impossible? The answer would prove almost as complicated as the battle itself, because in the United States, Army recognition is never simple, and the enemies Vito faced in the bureaucracy of Washington would require a different kind of courage than the Germans in Hatton. January 11, 1945. Field Hospital, 12 miles behind the front lines. Vito Bertoldo regained consciousness in a canvas tent that smelled of antiseptic and blood. His first sensation was pain. His second sensation was silence. The high-pitched ringing in his ears had faded to a dull roar that blocked most external sound. A medic stood over him holding a clipboard. The medic's lips moved, but Vito heard nothing. Ruptured eardrums, both sides. The concussive force of 4 direct artillery hits in 8 hours had destroyed the delicate membranes. Doctors told him hearing might return partially in weeks, or never. They could not predict. Vito's other injuries were catalogued with military precision. 3 cracked ribs on the left side, severe contusions across his back and shoulders from being thrown into walls repeatedly, multiple shrapnel wounds in his arms and legs, minor white phosphorus burns on his hands from the grenades he had thrown, severe dehydration from 48 hours without water, extreme exhaustion from 48 hours without sleep. The medical officer wrote in his report that Sergeant Bertoldo should have died at least 4 times during the engagement. The fact that he survived defied medical probability. But survival was only the beginning of Vito's problems. While Vito recovered in the field hospital, the Battle of Hatton continued. The reinforcements that rescued him pushed the Germans back, but fighting remained intense for 10 more days. Operation Nordwind, the German offensive to recapture Alsace, ground forward despite heavy losses. The 21st Panzer Division that Vito had fought continued attacking American positions throughout the sector. But something had changed. Reports from German prisoners captured in the days after January 10th revealed an unexpected development. Word had spread through German units about the machine gunner at Hatton. The stories grew with each retelling. One American had held an entire battalion for 2 days. One American had survived 4 direct hits from tank shells. One American had killed 50 men, 60 men, 80 men. The numbers inflated with each telling. German soldiers began referring to the Hatton position as the Maschinengewehr Nest des Teufels, the Devil's Machine Gun Nest. Officers had to reassure their men that the defender was just one soldier, not some supernatural force. But reassurance only goes so far when soldiers have watched their comrades die in waves against a single gun position. Morale in the 21st Panzer Division dropped measurably in the week following Hatton. Attack momentum slowed. Soldiers hesitated before advancing on American positions. The legend of the machine gunner had become a weapon itself. Back at division headquarters, officers pieced together what had actually happened at Hatton. The initial reports seemed impossible. 1 man, 48 hours, 40+ confirmed kills. 2 command posts defended. 517 personnel evacuated safely. Staff officers interviewed survivors from both command posts. They walked the battlefield counting German bodies. They examined the destroyed bakery and the shell-damaged alternate command post. They measured the distances between Vito's firing positions and the German dead. The evidence was overwhelming. Sergeant Vito Bertoldo had accomplished something unprecedented. Colonel James Gruenwald, commanding officer of the 242nd Infantry Regiment, reviewed the reports personally. He had served in the First World War. He had seen extraordinary acts of courage, but nothing like this. Gruenwald summoned his adjutant. "I want a Medal of Honor recommendation prepared for Sergeant Bertoldo." The adjutant hesitated. "Sir, the Medal of Honor requires extensive documentation, congressional approval, months of review." Gruenwald cut him off. "Then start documenting. This man held 2 German battalions alone for 2 days. If that does not deserve the Medal of Honor, nothing does." The paperwork began. But paperwork in the United States Army is never simple, and the Medal of Honor is the most difficult recognition to obtain. The Medal of Honor nomination process in World War II was deliberately rigorous. Congress had established strict criteria to prevent inflation of the award. The action must be above and beyond the call of duty. The action must involve risk of life. The action must be verified by multiple eyewitnesses. The recommendation must pass through multiple levels of command review, and the action must stand out even among other acts of extraordinary heroism. Thousands of soldiers performed courageously in World War II. Fewer than 500 received the Medal of Honor. The odds were against any individual nomination succeeding. Vito's case presented unique challenges. Most of his action occurred alone. The battalion staff had evacuated during his defense. The soldiers who found him at the end could testify to his condition, but not to the hours of combat that preceded their arrival. Eyewitness testimony was limited. The strongest evidence was physical. German bodies in the streets, spent casings by the thousands. Shell craters exactly where witnesses said Vito had been positioned moments before impact. The destroyed machine gun still warm when reinforcements arrived. But physical evidence required interpretation, and interpretation invited doubt. The nomination moved up the chain of command. Regiment approved, division approved, corps approved. At each level, officers reviewed the documentation and asked the same questions. Could one man really have done this? Were the casualty counts accurate? Was there any possibility of exaggeration? At 7th Army Headquarters, a staff colonel raised objections. The numbers seem inflated. 40 kills by one soldier in 48 hours. That averages to nearly 1 kill per hour. Around the clock. Without sleep. Without relief. The colonel recommended sending the nomination back for additional verification. But General Alexander Patch, commanding 7th Army, overruled him. Patch had read intelligence reports about German morale in the sector. He had seen the prisoner interrogations describing the Devil's machine gun nest. He had reviewed casualty figures showing German losses at Hatton far exceeded American estimates of defensive capability. The evidence supports the nomination, Patch wrote. Forward to Theater Command. The nomination continued upward. European Theater of Operations approved. War Department approved. The recommendation reached the desk of Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall in Washington. Marshall reviewed hundreds of Medal of Honor nominations during the war. He approved Vito's without modification. The nomination moved to Congress for final authorization. But congressional review took time. Months of bureaucratic processing while Vito recovered from his wounds and returned to duty. February 1945. Vito's hearing partially returned. The ringing faded to a manageable level. He could hear voices if people spoke loudly and faced him directly. His ribs healed. His wounds closed. The Army declared him fit for duty and sent him back to his unit. The Rainbow Division was pushing into Germany now. The war was entering its final months. Vito requested combat assignment. His commanders refused. They assigned him to rear echelon duties, training replacements, coordinating supply logistics, safe work far from the front lines. Vito protested. He had not survived Hatton to spend the rest of the war counting ammunition crates, but his commanders were firm. "Sergeant Bertoldo, you are too valuable to risk. Besides, they said there is a Medal of Honor nomination pending. We cannot have you getting killed before the ceremony." Vito did not know whether to be honored or insulted. He spent the remaining months of the European War in frustration watching other soldiers fight while he pushed papers. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The German surrender ended combat operations. Vito remained in Europe with occupation forces waiting for his nomination to complete congressional review. The bureaucracy moved slowly, even after the shooting stopped. Summer passed. Fall arrived. Finally, in November 1945, word came through official channels. The Medal of Honor had been approved. Vito would receive the award from President Harry Truman at the White House. The ceremony was scheduled for December 18, 1945, almost exactly 1 year after the battle that earned it. Vito flew back to the United States for the first time since shipping overseas. He landed in Washington wearing his dress uniform. His glasses were new now, Army-issue replacements for the wire-bound pair that had survived Hatton. He looked like any other sergeant returning from the war. No one at the airport recognized him. No one knew that the quiet man with thick glasses had killed 42 German soldiers in 48 hours using skills he learned in a coal mine. December 18, 1945. The White House. Vito stood in a reception room with other Medal of Honor recipients waiting for the ceremony to begin. 14 men would receive the award that day. Each had a story of impossible courage. Each had survived situations that should have killed them. Vito looked at their faces and saw the same expression he felt on his own. Not pride exactly. Something closer to bewilderment. They had done what needed doing in the moment. They had not thought about medals or recognition. They had thought about survival and protecting their fellow soldiers. Now they stood in the most famous house in America, waiting for the president to hang ribbons around their necks. The ceremony itself was brief. President Truman moved down the line, reading citations and presenting medals. When he reached Vito, he paused. The citation was longer than most. Master Sergeant Vito Bertoldo, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. Truman read the summary of Hatton. The 48 hours, the multiple command posts, the artillery strikes survived, the 40-plus enemy killed, the 517 Americans saved. Truman placed the medal around Vito's neck and shook his hand. The citation concluded with words that captured something essential about what Vito had done. He fought with magnificent courage and heroic determination, and by his individual valor and tenacity, held 2 successive positions against the assault of vastly superior forces, saving the lives of at least a battalion of his comrades. After the ceremony, General Dwight Eisenhower requested a private conversation with Vito. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe wanted to meet the coal miner who had held 2 German battalions alone. The content of their conversation was never documented. Whatever Eisenhower said remained between the 2 men. But witnesses reported that Eisenhower shook Vito's hand for a long time and that when Vito left the room, his eyes were wet. The newspapers covered the ceremony. Vito's photograph appeared in papers across the country. Coal miner wins Medal of Honor. The headlines read, "Illinois native kills 40 Germans in 2 days." For a brief moment, Vito Bertoldo was famous. Reporters requested interviews. His hometown of Decatur celebrated. The Decatur Coal Company, where Vito had worked for 9 years, issued a statement of pride in their former employee. But Vito did not enjoy the attention. When reporters asked him to describe Hatton, he gave the same answer every time. "All I did was try to protect some other American soldiers from being killed. At no time did I have in mind that I was trying to win something." The Battle of Hatton held larger significance beyond Vito's individual heroism. The town remained in American hands for 10 days after Vito's defense, until January 20, 1945. Operation Nordwind ultimately failed. The German offensive captured some territory, but fell far short of its objectives. Strasbourg, the symbolic prize Hitler wanted, remained in Allied hands. Historians estimate that the delay caused by stubborn American defense at positions like Hatton cost the Germans crucial momentum. Every day the offensive stalled was a day American reinforcements arrived. Every day was a day German supplies dwindled. Every day was a day closer to the final Allied victory. Vito did not win the war at Hatton, but he contributed to the conditions that made victory possible. 517 soldiers he saved went on to fight in other battles. Some survived to return home, some did not. But all of them had the chance to keep fighting because one coal miner refused to retreat. The official tallies from Hatton tell part of the story. 42 confirmed German kills by Vito Bertoldo. Military historians believe the actual number was higher, perhaps 60 to 80, when accounting for wounded who died later, and bodies removed by German recovery teams during lulls in fighting. The 1st Battalion of the 242nd Infantry Regiment suffered 66% casualties during the 3 days of January 9th through 11th. They started with 781 men and ended with 264 effectives. But the battalion survived as a fighting unit. It continued operations. It helped push the Germans back. Without Vito's defense, the command posts would have fallen. Documents would have been captured. Officers would have been killed or taken prisoner. The battalion might have ceased to exist as an organized force. Instead, it endured. Battered but intact. Ready to fight again. That was Vito's true legacy. Not the 42 Germans he killed, but the 517 Americans he saved. But what happened to the man himself after the medals and the ceremonies and the newspaper headlines faded? What became of the coal miner with cracked glasses who learned to fight in the darkness 600 feet underground? The answer to that question reveals something important about heroes and how America treats them. Because Vito Bertoldo's story did not end with the Medal of Honor. It continued for 21 more years, and those years contained their own battles, their own struggles, their own quiet courage that no medal could recognize. In Part 4, we will follow Vito from the White House back to civilian life. We will see what the war cost him and what he built from the wreckage. We will learn how a man who survived the impossible found meaning in the ordinary, and we will discover the final chapter of the coal miner's story. A chapter that ends not with glory, but with a hospital bed in California and a disease that even courage could not defeat. The war gave Vito Bertoldo 48 hours of fame. What came after would test him in ways the Germans never could. In Part 1, we met Vito Bertoldo, a nearly blind coal miner rejected twice by the United States Army and forced to serve as a cook. In Part 2, we watched him hold 2 command posts alone for 48 hours, against 2 German battalions, surviving 4 direct artillery hits and killing 42 enemy soldiers. In Part 3, we followed his Medal of Honor nomination through the bureaucracy of Washington until President Harry Truman placed the medal around his neck at the White House. From a discipline problem cooking breakfast in a mess hall to a national hero shaking hands with generals. From cracked glasses held together with wire to newspaper headlines across America. Vito Bertoldo had accomplished the impossible. But here is what the newspapers never reported. Here is what the Medal of Honor citation never mentioned. Here is the twist that no one expected. Because surviving the war was only the beginning of Vito's battle. And the enemy waiting for him back home was one that even courage could not defeat. January 1946. Vito Bertoldo received his honorable discharge from the United States Army. He was 29 years old. He had a Medal of Honor. He had a Silver Star. He had a Bronze Star with oak leaf cluster. He had a Purple Heart. He had the French Croix de Guerre. He had more decorations than most generals earn in a lifetime of service. And he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The coal mines of Decatur, Illinois, held no appeal. 9 years underground had been enough. The darkness that once felt familiar now reminded him of the nights at Hatton, when German tanks prowled the streets and death waited around every corner. Vito could not go back underground. The war had changed him in ways he could not articulate. He moved to California, Marin County, north of San Francisco, as far from Illinois coal country as a man could get while remaining in America. The sunshine felt foreign after years of darkness, both underground and in the European winter. But Vito needed light. He needed warmth. He needed distance from everything he had been. He found work with the Veterans Administration in 1946. The irony was not lost on him. The same government that had rejected him twice for military service now employed him to help other veterans navigate the bureaucracy. Vito processed paperwork. He reviewed disability claims. He helped men who had survived the war figure out how to survive the peace. It was quiet work, meaningful work, but it was not enough. Vito married. The details remain sparse in historical records. His wife's name does not appear in the major accounts of his life. They had children. A family built in the California sunshine, far from the frozen streets of Hatton. Vito never talked about the war at home. When his children asked about his medals, he changed the subject. When neighbors learned he was a Medal of Honor recipient, they wanted stories. Vito had none to offer. All I did was try to protect some other American soldiers from being killed. That was his only answer. The same answer he gave reporters. The same answer he gave generals. The same answer he would give until the day he died. Some men return from war eager to share their experiences. They write memoirs. They give speeches. They become living monuments to their own heroism. Vito was not that kind of man. The 48 hours at Hatton existed in a sealed compartment of his memory. He had done what needed doing. He had survived. Talking about it served no purpose. The men he saved knew what he had done. The Germans he killed knew what he had done. God knew what he had done. That was enough. But the war had left marks that no medal could cover and no silence could erase. In 1958, Vito left the Veterans Administration after 12 years of service. He started a landscaping business in Marin County, working with his hands again, shaping earth and plants instead of processing paperwork. The physical labor felt good. It reminded him of the mines in a way, the honest exhaustion of a day spent building something. His business grew modestly. He was not wealthy, but he was comfortable. He had his family. He had his home. He had his quiet life far from the darkness of coal seams and the thunder of German artillery. But something was wrong. Vito had developed a cough that would not go away. At first he ignored it. Coal miners coughed. Everyone who spent years breathing coal dust developed respiratory problems. But the cough grew worse. By the early 1960s, Vito was coughing blood. The diagnosis came with the weight of inevitability: lung cancer. The doctors could not say with certainty what caused it. 9 years breathing coal dust, 600 feet underground. 48 hours breathing smoke and gunpowder and white phosphorus fumes in Hatton. Probably both. The war had killed Vito Bertoldo. It just took 20 years to finish the job. But his legacy was only beginning to take shape. The story of Hatton did not die with the newspapers of December 1945. Military historians studying the Alsace campaign returned to Vito's action again and again. His defense became a case study in what one determined soldier could accomplish against overwhelming odds. The Army War College used Hatton as an example in courses on defensive tactics. Infantry training manuals referenced his techniques, the way he moved between firing positions, the way he conserved ammunition, the way he used the geometry of buildings to create multiple fields of fire. These were not innovations Vito invented. They were adaptations of skills he learned underground. But they were skills the Army had never formally taught. And they worked. The lessons of Hatton influenced defensive doctrine for decades. In Korea, American soldiers defending positions against Chinese human wave attacks employed similar tactics. Move, fire, move again. Never let the enemy fix your position. In Vietnam, soldiers facing Viet Cong assaults used the same principles. The individual rifleman as a mobile defensive asset rather than a stationary target. The specific techniques evolved with new weapons and new enemies, but the core principle remained. One soldier in the right position, with the right mindset, can hold ground against forces that should overwhelm him. Vito proved that at Hatton. Thousands of soldiers learned from his example without ever knowing his name. The Medal of Honor itself carried weight beyond the individual recipient. Vito was one of 472 soldiers to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. Each medal represented an extraordinary act. Each medal told a story of courage beyond calculation. But Vito's medal carried special significance because of who he was. Not a career officer, not a trained commando, not a natural warrior. A coal miner with bad eyes who spent 2 years arguing his way out of the kitchen. The army that rejected him twice ended up pinning its highest honor on his chest. That contradiction mattered. It demonstrated that heroism could emerge from anywhere. The military establishment that dismissed Vito as unfit for combat was forced to acknowledge that fitness for combat cannot be measured by an eye chart. Character matters more than visual acuity. Determination matters more than formal training. The will to fight matters more than the bureaucratic categories that sort men into roles they may not fit. Vito's story became proof that the system sometimes gets it wrong. And when the system gets it wrong, the individual can still get it right. The broader lessons of Hatton extend beyond military tactics into questions of human potential and institutional blindness. How many Vito Bertoldos were rejected by draft boards and never given the chance to prove themselves? How many men with bad eyes or flat feet or minor physical defects possessed the character to accomplish extraordinary things but were never tested? We cannot know. The war ended. The men who were rejected went on with their lives, never knowing what they might have done. But Vito's example suggests that the criteria used to evaluate potential are often inadequate. The Army looked at Vito and saw a liability. Poor vision meant poor shooting. Poor shooting meant ineffective combat performance. The logic was sound, but the conclusion was wrong. Vito's 9 years underground had given him capabilities the Army could not measure. Spatial awareness in darkness. Calm under pressure. The ability to function in confined spaces while chaos erupted around him. These skills had no checkbox on the medical examination form. They could not be quantified or scored. But they were exactly the skills needed at Hatton on January 9th and 10th of 1945. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovations and exceptional performances often come from outsiders. Men who do not fit the standard profile. Men whose ideas are dismissed as ridiculous until circumstances prove them essential. The bouncing bomb that destroyed German dams was designed by an aircraft engineer with no military background. The landing craft that made D-Day possible was developed by a boat builder from Louisiana. Radar was championed by scientists the military establishment initially ignored. Again and again, the pattern holds. The expert consensus dismisses an idea. The outsider persists. Reality vindicates the outsider. Vito fits this pattern not as an inventor, but as a performer. The experts said he could not fight. He proved them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. His story stands as a reminder that expertise has limits, that institutions can be blind to potential they lack the tools to measure, that sometimes the discipline problem is exactly the person you need when everything falls apart. There is one final detail about Vito Bertoldo that most accounts overlook. A small fact buried in the archives that changes how we understand his 48 hours at Hatton. When the reinforcements arrived on January 10th, they found Vito still gripping his destroyed machine gun. His glasses were cracked. His uniform was soaked with blood. He was barely conscious. But one detail stood out to the soldiers who found him. Vito was smiling, not a grimace, not the frozen expression of shock. A genuine smile. One of the soldiers who found him later wrote in a letter home that Sergeant Bertoldo looked like a man who had just finished a good day of work. The kind of satisfied expression you might see on a farmer at the end of harvest, or a carpenter who has just completed a house. Vito had spent 9 years working shifts that could kill him at any moment. He had spent those years knowing that every day underground might be his last. The coal mine had taught him to appreciate survival. And at Hatton, when the reinforcements finally arrived, Vito was simply appreciating the fact that he was still alive. The smile was not pride or triumph, it was gratitude. The same gratitude a coal miner feels when he climbs out of the shaft at the end of a 12-hour shift and sees daylight. July 23, 1966. Veterans Hospital, Martinez, California. Vito Bertoldo died of lung cancer at the age of 49. He had outlived the war by 21 years. He had built a life in California with a family and a business, and the quiet dignity of a man who had proven everything he needed to prove. The newspapers ran obituaries. Medal of Honor. Recipient dies. Coal miner hero succumbs to cancer. The stories retold Hatton one more time. The 48 hours. The 42 kills. The 517 soldiers saved. Then the newspapers moved on. There was always more news. More wars. More heroes. More stories. Vito Bertoldo was buried with military honors. His medals were preserved. His citation remained in the official records. But the man himself was gone. The coal miner who learned to survive in darkness and applied those lessons in the light of battle. Gone. What remains is the example. A man rejected by the system who proved the system wrong. A cook who became a killer of the enemy not for glory, but for duty. A discipline problem who displayed more discipline under fire than soldiers with years of training. Vito Bertoldo did not ask to be a hero. He asked only to be allowed to fight. When the opportunity finally came, he fought with everything he had. 9 years of working in darkness. 9 years of listening for the sounds of death. 9 years of moving through confined spaces where panic meant burial alive. All of it came together in a French bakery in January of 1945. The skills the army said were worthless turned out to be exactly what was needed when hundreds of German soldiers advanced through frozen streets and the men he was protecting needed time to escape. From a coal miner with broken glasses to a Medal of Honor recipient who saved 517 American soldiers, Vito Bertoldo proved that courage has no prescription requirements and that the most unlikely heroes are sometimes the most extraordinary. In 48 hours, he killed more enemy soldiers than most infantry companies killed in months of combat. He survived 4 direct artillery hits that should have killed him instantly. He held 2 command posts alone against 2 battalions of veteran German troops. And when reinforcements finally arrived, he was still fighting, still firing, still refusing to accept that the mathematics of war said he should be dead. The coal mine taught Vito Bertoldo that survival is a choice you make again and again in the darkness. At Hatton, he made that choice for 48 hours straight, and 517 American families got their sons and brothers and fathers back because of it. If you know another story like this, a story of an ordinary person who accomplished the impossible in World War II, share it in the comments. History is full of men and women whose names we have forgotten, but whose actions changed the course of the war. Vito Bertoldo is one of thousands. The cook who became a killer. The reject who became a hero. The discipline problem who displayed more courage than generals. This is why we tell these stories. Not because they are entertaining, though they are. Not because they are dramatic, though they are. But because they remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the moment demands it. Vito Bertoldo did not know he was going to be a hero when he woke up on January 9, 1945. He found out the same way all heroes find out, by doing what needed to be done when no one else could do it. That is the true legacy of Hatton, not the medals or the citations or the newspaper headlines. The simple truth that when everything fails, the individual can still succeed. When the mathematics say impossible, the human spirit can say otherwise. Vito Bertoldo spent 9 years learning to survive in darkness. And when the darkness came for 517 of his fellow soldiers, he stood in its way and said, "Not today." That is what heroes do. That is what Vito did. And that is why his story deserves to be remembered long after the last veteran of World War II is gone.